welcome to Broadsheets, a political panel show here on Quays TV discussing this week in British politics. I'm Samantha Stimpson and today I'm joined by Alfie Garner and Alfie Mulcahy. Today we will be talking to you about the return of possible austerity, the reform row and the future of Holyrood. So, thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us on.
Yeah, so we're going to kick this off with, is Starmer bringing back austerity? That was one headline on Sky News this morning. And this was because of the proposed cut in welfare benefits and the abolishment of the NHS England. So can you two both, share what's going on here?
Well, I don't think the abolition of NHS England is an austerity measure. I'd argue it's actually the opposite, because NHS England was introduced, 12 years ago now? 12, 13 years ago? Yeah. Under the Conservatives. And I think all it's really done is added an extra level of bureaucracy to our health service, because obviously you've got all the regional control centres of the NHS. You've then got the UK-wide strategy team. NHS England is sort of a micromanaging body in the middle, trying to be across everything, but in reality just adding an extra layer of paperwork and an extra marketing department, stuff like that. So I think in cutting NHS England, we might see some savings and possibly some more money go into the actual health service.
Do you both think this is a duplication of the Department of the Health and Safety of England?
No, I think it's more a case of it's sort of changing how healthcare works in the UK, because it's, as Alfie said, back in sort of 2011, 2012 sort of time, it was changed to be, so it was out of government control but government funded. So it had a lot of duplications with other UK services that are government departments. So what's happening now under Labour is a change towards sort of making sure that what happens in the NHS is looked at by both industry professionals but also the government experts and the government ministers who kind of control that money anyway. So it just gives more of an idea for both Keir Starmer and the wider Labour government on how the NHS is run, rather than the occasional update from the NHS bosses within England.
Do you both think that this is, as the Prime Minister said, bringing the NHS back into democratic control? I
think it is, yeah. And Jeremy Hunt was talking on, I think it was PM on Radio 4 yesterday. He was saying that NHS England, part of it was to remove the politicisation of the health system. But I think in doing that, some people might think it's removed the essence of public control that it's had since the very start. So there are two very different ways of looking at it. You can either look at it's bringing the parties and the politicisation out of our healthcare, or you can look at it in the way that Keir Starmer's been framing it, in that with the creation of NHS England, it was removing the public control, the democratic control aspect from the health system.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also making sure that NHS England is run as a public service, not as a private business, which many fear that during the Conservative government was happening a lot. You had the introduction of the charges for prescriptions as well, the more private-esque dentist system. So all it's going to really do is bring it into that public control, so the public have more of an idea of what's happening, but also it's just going to end up having more public say about what happens with the NHS, rather than one NHS boss really running the entire show.
Okay, and when we think of the government and the health service, the face that we think of is Wes Streeting, and he said this morning that over 9,000 people will lose their jobs and that he himself did not anticipate this announcement. What happened to communication within the cabinet?
Communication in the cabinet has been really poor recently. There's very much a sense of people don't know what's going on other than in their individual departments. So sort of.
But that is his individual department, and he didn't know this was going to happen.
Exactly, that's what I mean. There's not really the communication unless it's direct sort of thing. So by the sounds of it, Keir Starmer didn't go to Wes Streeting to inform him before he went to Hull to make the speech. So all we're seeing is sort of overground and overhead of the Chancellor and the Prime Minister sort of making these big decisions, which many people would support, but not telling the other departments like the Department of Health, but also other departments like culture, sport and media. So we're seeing sort of a bigger divide within the government that could come back to bite Keir Starmer in the future when more big decisions are made without other people knowing about it first, so they can have their input on it.
And a few months ago, the Speaker of the House, he condemned politicians for going to the media first rather than, opening it to the House. Would this fall into the same category of going to the journalists first?
I think it would. I think he'd have less of a problem with this incident. This was announcing it in quite a public way to the public and the press. Lots of the complaints that have happened in the past have been where politicians have leaked stuff to the press in order to sort of stress test how the policy would go down with the public. I think this is a slightly different flavour, but it's still kind of circumventing the proper way of doing it, where you go to the where you discuss it with your cabinet agrees, you take it to the Commons, MPs can discuss, and then it goes on to the next stages after that. I think it's kind of ruled by social media, ruled by word of mouth, rather than following those processes we've had for many years.
So have we concluded that this NHS England being abolished does not fall into austerity?
I don't think so. No.
I don't think it does.
Okay, well, what about welfare cuts?
Yeah, well, during the election and during every Labour election, we kind of see them pose themselves as the party for the working man and the working woman. They pose themselves as looking out for the working classes. But this round of welfare cuts, and we don't know the exact details yet, but these welfare cuts are certainly sending the message that all of these things during the election that they were saying about helping working people, they're not taking that quite as seriously. But on the other hand, we've seen from the government, from Rachel Reeves in particular, that there's this real drive to get the economy moving again and to get people back into work. So it's that difficult balancing act. You want to support people, as I'm sure the Labour Party does, but you also want a thriving economy and to try and help those people who've maybe not been able to work get back into that system.
So the only way you can afford to help people is if, we've got a working economy. So the benefits, the sickness and disability benefits, is forecast to cost the government £70 billion by 2030. How are they going to ensure that people return back to work so that they can afford these benefits?
Well, that's the thing. It's how potentially it's not being thought thoroughly as how it's going to happen. Maybe how they're going to cut back and sort of make these savings, but people need encouragement to do stuff like work. So a higher wage, a higher living wage. So it is going up to £12 next month, but maybe increasing that to sort of a £15 minimum wage would certainly incentivise a lot more people to go back to work, because the system at the moment is, well, at the moment the welfare system is paying me more than getting a job at a supermarket would. Why would I bother going to work? So we need, in that sense, incentivising them through pay could be one of the big things, but also incentivising them through other schemes. So maybe looking at how sort of almost like a tax cut essentially for the working class, making sure that they feel like sort of when they get paid, half of it's not being taken by the government and through national insurance or income tax. That could be another way to incentivise them, because then they can keep hold of that tax, go and spend it in their local economy, which will then boost the economy further. So sort of incentivising them as well to spend in local shopping centres rather than online stores like Amazon could be one of the biggest ways to do it. Maybe offering some sort of subsidy through HMRC to business owners who are local, who sort of have less than 5 stores or less than 5 employees, sort of incentivise them to reduce their price because they're getting something back from the government. That could be one of the biggest ways to do it, because you're just then telling them, hey, we're supporting you to spend in your local area, which will help your local community thrive, but also the economy to thrive even further and grow, which can mean you get better jobs by going to university or going to a college course that we fund for you. So it's that sort of thing of ensuring that people have that incentive to go back, rather than just saying, we're just going to cut your welfare, in the simplest phrase, because it's not how it works.
So the government need to ensure a long-term incentive.
I would say so. I think it needs to be that the government incentivises both the people working, who are currently out of work, who can work, because there's a view that people who are on benefits can't work, or people who are on benefits are too lazy to work. A lot of them really cannot work. A lot of them's been through either trauma in the past at a previous workplace that kind of prevents them, or have certain health conditions that prevent them from being on the floor or standing up for multiple hours. So you kind of, those who can work, and there is a few that can work within the benefit system, encouraging them to go back to a place of work that feels comfortable for them.
Should the benefit system see a change, do you think? So instead of having like 2 categories of being fit for work or not fit for work, should it see a reform to have more categories within it, like Ofsted would, with their new system?
I think there's far more nuance in benefits and who needs them than the current system allows. It's very much an on or off switch, whereas there are some people who are on benefits but maybe don't need monetary support. If they've got a long-term health condition, they might need care support. So I think the system kind of needs to be looked at in a way where different types of support are looked at. So if someone who's long-term ill needs care, that can be delivered directly to them rather than giving money or not giving money.
Okay, so the big quote from Keir Starmer was calling it the welfare system, the welfare bills, unsustainable, indefensible and unfair, and some other notable quotes from him this week are calling it flabby as well. So he wants to support more people getting into work, but there are campaigns against this. So while it could seem as reasonable to encourage more people into work, what's the other side of this?
The other side of this is making sure those who are disabled have the ability to afford their life, because it costs more to be disabled. That's a simple fact. Scope sent a letter with other disability charities, but also benefits charities, to the Chancellor saying life costs more for disabled people. Huge numbers already live in poverty as a result of these extra costs. Cutting back more would simply just basically wipe them out into full-blown poverty. So we're seeing this reaction of the government saying this is actually really good for our economy because it might encourage more people to get into work, but people, the charities like Scope, saying actually a lot of these people already face difficult times in their lives. You cutting back PIP or universal credit will only make it worse.
Okay, well, thank you both. We're going to move on from the austerity issues to perhaps one of the biggest stories in politics, and particularly right-wing politics this week, is the reform row. So as we know, Rupert Lowe has been suspended from the Reform UK party, which means there is an equal amount of MPs for Reform as there is for Green. The first question before we move on to the focusing on Reform party is, will there be more attention to the Green MPs now that they've got the same amount as Reform?
I think in the interest of fairness there should be. I don't think there will be, because as much as the Greens have a lot of policies, especially on environmental issues, Reform is far more exciting to report on, more exciting to look at. So they will still end up with that media traction because they are the more exciting version.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. So Reform had a massive base because Nigel Farage. And they'll have that base because Nigel Farage is still the leader of the party. So whether or not you can see the BBC or Sky moving towards a model that includes Green more, it won't be equal, which is part of the sort of media landscape at the moment. Is in the worst ways possible, Nigel Farage brings in the clicks for these big organisations. They bring in sort of these big numbers that they need for revenue or for their publicity. So Green will get more attention, but they won't get equal. 100% will not get equal. So a prime example would be something like Question Time. Whether we'll see more of Farage or whether we'll see more of the likes of Carla Dania is something that the BBC needs to now think about very closely, because they've got equal representation in Parliament. Will they have equal representation in the media?
Okay, now that we're moving on to the Reform Party, can either one of you just describe what happened in this past week?
I think what we're kind of looking at is two different stories. You've got Rupert Lowe's side of the story, and you've got the sort of reform machine side of the story. Rupert Lowe says that he's been sacked, had the whip removed, because the day before he was removed, he opposed some of the policies in private, and he said some stuff that was a bit anti-Farage and questioning the leadership structure and some of the policies of Reform. Reform would say he's had these complaints against him, several allegations made to Reform and to the Metropolitan Police, who are now doing an investigation, and Reform say they've just acted upon that and suspended the whip from someone who's had serious allegations against them.
Okay, so where will he go? He's now standing as an independent. Will we see a splinter to Reform, even though we could see Reform as a splinter to the Conservatives?
Well, what we've seen is he is standing as an independent. Many organisations are now saying, will he move to the Conservatives, sort of try and be high up within the Conservative movement, because he's already high up within the right-wing online media. So it's a question of, should he move to the Conservatives, or should he create his own minor party that is very much fundamental on these right-wing views, and so bring that to Parliament? Because if he moves to the Conservatives, it would help them. It wouldn't necessarily help Rupert, because even though they got demolished at the last election, how big the Conservatives still are. Because he was in Reform, he still had a sort of equal amount of measure when it came to being seen, because there was only 5 members. Whereas if he moves to Conservatives, there's about 150 members. So we'll see that. If he goes to his own party, would that mean that he would get the representation he wants? Because, yes, it's all good saying I own a party and I sort of lead a party, but it doesn't necessarily mean he will get the attention he wants because of how the system works. I think at the moment his best bet is to stay as an independent, sort of let this ride out, potentially go back to Reform once this is all over, see if the Met says anything that could damage his political career. If the Met comes back saying these allegations are false, will Lee Anderson give the whip back to him in a sense of, sorry, we were wrong, have it back, rejoin us?
I don't think there's any danger at all of Rupert Lowe splintering off and creating his own party, because whilst people like us, people who are excited by this sort of thing and follow it closely, know who Rupert Lowe is, and whilst he has that little group following him online for his that far-right group following his actions, he's actually not that big a figure. He's one of the more minor members of that big Reform 5 that got elected over the summer. But
statistics this week came out that like almost 70% of people didn't know who he was by his picture.
Yeah, exactly. So he doesn't have anywhere near as high a profile as Nigel Farage or Lee Anderson do. So I don't think there's any danger to Reform of Rupert Lowe going off and forming his own splinter party. He might do it, but it would crash and burn, because it doesn't have the big media machine behind it. It doesn't have the big names Farage and Lee Anderson to sort of back it up. And Reform's come so far in the last couple of years. A new party filling up roughly the same political space isn't going to have that same traction.
Do you think it's weakened Reform this week? Has it made the right-wing opposition a bit weaker, and has it affected the grassroots levels of Reform?
I don't think it has. The polling still says Reform is very likely to win the next election. It's still close between the Conservatives, Labour and Reform, but it is still that third party. It still has a massive stronghold over the voters' opinion. but also seeing a third of voters who voted for Reform in the last election want a new leader. So Reform will have that sort of powerhouse and the knowledge that they are kind of safe where they are, but will it mean that they get more people, more MPs in the next election? Because a lot of, I heard this morning, Labour's now thinking 2029, not what's happening now. Reform are going to have to do the same to make sure that they get as many MPs as they want in the next election.
I think the events of the last week have done different things for different parts of Reform's bases. You'll have that sort of more centrist Reform base who have moved from the Conservatives, or maybe from a different party, to supporting Reform, who were maybe worried about how trustworthy they are as a party, whether they will do the right thing morally. I think it will have, in their minds, improved Reform, because they've seen Reform act like one of the bigger parties, and when allegations have been brought to them, they've taken action. On the other hand, you've got the slightly more extreme wing. You've got people that might have come the other way, or from a sort of social media bubble, who might be seeing as Reform is acting like an establishment party, and this is bad. So you've got those two very different things. And I think they'll cancel each other out. But it's really interesting the space that Reform is occupying, because you've got these kind of two different wings, people wanting it to be more like an establishment party and people wanting it to be very anti-establishment. And I think they're trying to find that balance at the minute.
Okay, well, Alfie Garner, earlier you mentioned that it could be okay if, in a few weeks people might forget about this, and that's similar to what Dame Andrea Jenkins said, that it's going to blow over and Lowe will be back in the Reform Party. But do you think after all this he will, want to go back to sort of where he got his disgrace from?
I think it will be very much a case of he will look towards it. Whether or not he returns is a different question, because he has this now experience of what it's like to be removed from Reform UK. Will he want to risk that again? Go back to the party that he knows? Or would he want to stay as an independent until the next election and just try and maintain a lead in his constituency? I think he will stay as an independent MP, try and just pass by, look towards the future, see if a return to Reform is possible. If it is, question it very heavily, sort of with the people who voted for him. If it's not, sort of look towards a different party, because he wouldn't be able, I don't think he'd be able to stand as an independent MP and get as much votes as he think he would, because we have said this, he's not well known outside the political sphere. So we know him. Does people in his constituency know him, or is it just sort of Reform UK and tick the box?
So what about his constituents? They voted a Reform politician in. They no longer have a member of Reform representing them. Well,
the BBC went. They went to both his seat and Farage's seat, and they asked people, "What do you think of the last week?" And lots of people saying, "In this country, you are innocent until proven guilty," and that Nigel Farage had acted too quickly. And from speaking to those constituents, lots and lots of the people that the BBC spoke to on Wednesday were very much of the opinion that Rupert Lowe had been kicked out earlier than he should have done, and that he should have been maybe taken back from regular duties but kept on the books. And I think they just see it as a bit of a mess, really. But I think it will blow over, and I think he'll want to rejoin Reform in a few months. Whether Reform will want him back, because over the last week he's said quite a few things on social media quite against Reform and quite against Farage specifically. So whether they want him back in the party is a very another matter. But I think in a few months he'll try and get back.
Okay, now moving on to our final topic. According to the paper, she's the Marmite of politicians, and this week Nicola Sturgeon has announced she will not stand at Holyrood in the next election. So she's not going to be in the next election. She's been a member of the Scottish Parliament since 1999. Sturgeon resigned as the SNP leader in 2023. And, that's nearly 2 years ago since her resignation. Why has it took so long for her to announce that she won't be, representing Glasgow Southside?
It's very surprising that it's taken so long, because she had this massive police investigation against her and her husband for stealing funds from the party. So the fact that she stuck around for nearly 2 years before announcing her intention not to rerun is quite a surprise. But she has been in sort of Scottish politics since the very late 90s. We see this in politicians. They stay in politics for a while, then as they fear their time comes loose, say they're not going to be run or they're going to stand down before the next election. So we saw it with Theresa May. She was in frontline politics for decades. She said she wasn't going to stand in the next election and then became a member of the Lords. Whether she's worried about getting re-elected or whether she just needs a break from frontline politics, we'll see that, because she still has this heavy head within the SNP. She's still well known. She has been well known for the last few years because of the progress she made during the pandemic. She's really well known for that, but also her fight for Scottish independence was second to none when it comes to the SNP, because she fought really hard for that second referendum between 2014 and her resignation. So she's well known enough to potentially stay on, but I think there's a potential that her votes would hinder because of these issues she's faced in the last 3 years.
I don't think it's particularly surprising that we've had the announcement now, because obviously the election's just over a year away in Holyrood. We've seen over the last couple of years she's resigned as leader. We've had all this stuff about her and her husband and party funds, but I think she's very much of the opinion that she's there to serve her constituents. And I think she would have thought long and hard about whether she wanted to stand again. She's obviously decided that it's in either her best interest or the party's to stand aside in the next election. I don't think it's a surprise that it's come at this moment, because the SNP want to try and find someone to take over her constituency to get those roots into that area, whilst leaving it long enough after the controversies we've seen over the last couple of years for there to be a bit of a clean break, so she can have that announcement and her career be looked back on in a more positive light than it would have been if she'd announced it at the same time she'd left the leadership.
So do you think that now that she's done the announcement this week, it's created a better impression and people can remember her for the whole span of her career than, say, if she had made the announcement back in 2023, it would be a bit more tainted?
I think so, because people would have still had that investigation and stuff fresh in their minds, that have had those images of the police vans and the police tents at her house. Whereas now, a couple of years on, she's announced that she won't be standing again. People can look back at the whole of her career and what she's done for Scotland, rather than focusing on that big event from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, 100%. But it also raises the question, will people forget the investigation? We saw it with the Conservatives at the last election. People didn't forget what happened during COVID, with Partygate and all the scandals that occurred. So we people won't necessarily forget. They'll just have it at the back of their mind as a thing of, she did do that, but she also did that, and did this. And I think this would overpower that when it comes to potential feelings about Nicola Sturgeon. She's still, again, really popular within the SNP because of the fight she made for Scotland to be independent. A lot of people in Scotland still, even though they didn't win the first referendum, still want independence from the UK, because over the last 14, sort of 14, 20 years, they've seen how the UK has kind of betrayed Scotland and left it behind, in a sense. So it's a mix of, I'm surprised she's on it now because it's still a year out, but I'm also a mix of sort of not worried about the fact that she's done it now, because she is not trying to save her career, but also just trying to think long term. What will she go into? Will she sort of go into more political commentary like she's started to do now? Will she just have a quiet time at home to try and sort of reflect and sort of see what the last 20 odd years have done to her personally, because she has said in the past that she hasn't had it plain sailing. She's had a lot of things to struggle about. So we will see that over the next few years. But I think she'll make her resurgence not in politics, but potentially in the media as a political commentator.
I think it possibly symbolises the end of sort of the SNP's golden years. You had Alex Salmond, you had Nicola Sturgeon. The SNP was an unbeatable force in Scotland. But now, looking towards the next Holyrood election, they're not going to have enough, pretty much definitely, for an overall majority. They'll have to form alliances, or we'll see potentially a Labour victory in Holyrood. So I think it really does symbolise the end, the closing of that chapter in the SNP's history of all that success under Alex Salmond, then under Nicola Sturgeon, and now her announcing she's standing down. Obviously, we've seen the death of Alex Salmond. That era is over now.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of other Scottish political leaders are saying. So the Scottish Labour leader, like you said, it's the end of an era. That's what he said. And then the Lib Dem leader said that the SNP have been in power for too long. So Alfie and Mulcahy, you say that they don't stand a chance of having a successful independent win, but only if they reach out to coalitions.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see them winning the next Holyrood election at all. They might have to rely on the Greens again, or we'll see a different party take power, probably Scottish Labour.
And let's not forget, during the last election, the SNP were decimated. They went from having 53 MPs in Westminster to having about 13. So they lost a lot of their coverage within Westminster to sort of fight for a second referendum. It sort of has a point where it says, will the same happen in Holyrood? Like Alfie says, will it sort of go back to this? Right, we've had this many years of the SNP. Why are we still not getting to the whole thing of, this is why we voted in the SNP, we haven't achieved this, why would I bother voting for you again to just have the same old?
Okay, well, thank you. My final question is, so Nicola Sturgeon announced this on Instagram, and the probably biggest quote from this is she's going to embrace different opportunities in a new chapter of her life. Alfie, you said that she could go into political commentary. Alfie Mulcahy, where do you think this new chapter will take Nicola Sturgeon?
I'm not really sure. I think we'll see her continue along the political commentary list, but equally, she might retire into the background. She's had her time. Mm-hmm. We might see her go and buy a house in the Highlands and live there with some nice Highland cows for the rest of her life. We just don't know.
Well, in 5 years' time, if that is what happened, what you did hear first. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
No worries.
This has been Broadsheets, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.